This is episode 9 of Democracy After Disaster, a 9-part documentary podcast series that is best listened to in order from way back in episode 1.
Hi, this is Dolly. Now, I know many of you, like me, have been watching the wildfires that have affected the Great Smoky Mountains around Gatlinburg, Tennessee, where I grew up.
In 2016, a wildfire destroyed over 1,000 homes in the Tennessee mountains, an area immortalised by Dolly Parton in a beautiful song, of course, called My Mountains.
Now, I've always believed that charity begins at home, and that's why I've asked my Dollywood companies to help me establish a My People's Fund. We want to make sure that the Dollywood Foundation provides $1,000 a month to all those families that have lost their homes in the fires until they get back up on their feet.
So I was driving home one day after teaching and I was listening to the radio and I heard that Dolly Parton was contributing $1,000 a month to each family that was impacted by the wildfires. And I thought to myself, this is a really genuine approach to dealing with disaster recovery. I thought I'd be interested in studying this.
This is Professor Stacia West from the University of Tennessee speaking on a video about the Dolly Parton initiative.
My research area focuses on economic inequality and increasingly focuses on universal basic income as a means to perhaps alleviate that inequality.
So universal basic income is an idea that we could pay everybody an amount of money that is enough for them to live a basic but adequate existence. So it would be a regular payment, it would be an individual payment, and it would be to everybody.
This is Ben Spies-Butcher, Associate Professor of Economy and Society at Macquarie University. The notion of a universal basic income, or UBI, has been around for at least a few centuries and comes from two main ideas.
One that stems from the idea that many of the resources used in the economy really are collective resources. And through the process of making our economy, we've privatised those resources. And that's denied some people access to a basic existence, and that we are all owed a basic amount of money to ensure that we can exist in the current economy that we have, given that we're fenced off from the resources we might otherwise need to be able to support ourselves. And I think there's a complementary philosophy, which is that it's just a basic prerequisite for being able to have a social community. Everyone needs just the very basics. It's a form of acknowledging that we are interdependent on each other and that everyone needs the basics to be able to survive.
When thinking about universal basic income, it's important to understand that it is in addition to and doesn't replace other elements of a good social system.
You still need to have a healthcare system. You need to have an education system. We need to have a housing policy that either delivers housing through social housing or through a model that makes housing affordable in other ways.
And you might be wondering, well, what's the difference between a UBI and, say, Australia's Centrelink payment system?
They're not like a basic income in the sense they're highly conditioned here, and they're very strongly means tested. And I think pretty obviously the payments, especially job seeker, aren't adequate.
Despite being a slow burn philosophy over hundreds of years, the idea of a UBI is gaining ground, as evidenced by the enormous international UBI conference Ben had just attended before we spoke. So it seems that in addition to ideas we need lying around, in the words of Martin Luther King, who was quoting Victor Hugo,
"There is nothing more powerful in all the world than an idea whose time has come."
And Martin Luther King hoped a guaranteed income would be such an idea.
In this America, people are poor by the millions, and they find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. We are demanding a guaranteed annual income at levels that sustain life in decent circumstances.
And it seems Dolly Parton has been the first one to bring it about for people impacted by disaster. This is Democracy After Disaster, a podcast about power and money and how communities recovering from bushfire or any disaster need to be empowered in their recovery if they're not to be further harmed by the systems meant to help them. My name's Kate Lawrence, and in this 9th and final episode of Democracy After Disaster, we're going to look at bigger structural changes in our social and political systems. We'll look in more detail at the universal basic income, as well as participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, participatory budgeting, and finally, self-organising systems. Because it's our capacity to innovate democracy, to stay true to its values, not attached to a current incarnation, to keep the baby as we wash away the bathwater, that is its strength and will be its redeemer. Since the 1960s and the era of MLK, the calls for a universal basic income have only become louder as the wealth gap has grown wider, and the evidence of the benefits of the UBI have become much stronger.
So there's a whole range of benefits which are now pretty robust in terms of the number of trials and the various types of trials we have that we can be quite confident about. The most profound ones now are around mental health, and that partly reflects the levels of insecurity that our economies are now producing. We're talking about evidence that is close to the effects you would get from some drugs. Insecurity is really corrosive to people's ability to participate in society. Anything that gives people a solid floor, a solid base to work from, helps solve all of the other problems as well.
So it's not hard to see that the impact of a guaranteed income for a period of time after a disaster would be significant for individual well-being. But there are also broader benefits, critically important in the context of community recovery and democracy.
We know there are strong increases in trust in neighbours, trust in government, so people get a sense of a much higher trust environment. And there is some evidence at the collective level as well, social trust, those kinds of outcomes. And so if anything, you've kind of got a build-up of human capital, which is increasing long-run economic outcomes.
So there's benefits to both the individual and to social cohesion. And then there's the way it supports those we know contribute to society, but which the market doesn't value.
From artists to carers to people who are rehabilitating our land and waters. It is also partly a way of us collectively saying what we value, rather than only having the market determine what is valuable.
And if that wasn't enough, there are a couple of other surprising benefits that are worth mentioning.
Having a universal system is administratively much simpler. It's also simpler not just in terms of how much money we spend in the bureaucracy, but actually most of the costs of administration of Australia's policy system are not borne by the state, they're borne by the people who have to navigate. So the people who spend endless hours on telephones to Centrelink, or that just never discover that there was support that they could have accessed.
Of course, there are arguments raised against a universal basic income. Here's Dave Dotson, president of the Dolly Foundation, followed by Professor West from the University of Tennessee.
I think the fear of these kinds of approaches are really twofold. One is that they'll spend the money unwisely, or it gives people an excuse not to work, right? And in our experience, neither one of those things happens.
Work hours were very stable across actually all 3 points of observation. So if we look at the day before the wildfires, if you will, people reported a median work hours of around 40 hours per week. 6 months out, it was also 40 hours. And then a year later, it was 40 hours.
Ben Spies-Butcher confirms that there's no evidence a UBI stops people working.
We're actually pretty confident that it doesn't have bad incentive effects. So it doesn't stop everyone from working. So that's not a real problem. In terms of the labour market effects, they're mixed, but they're largely because some cohorts, like particularly young men who would otherwise have dropped out of education, and particularly the mothers of very young children, tend to have lower levels of labour force participation. But we might say that that's quite a good thing, that we want them to engage in education for longer and spend more time with their kids. And they're not long-run effects, they're short-run effects.
The other main objection people raise is the cost. We can't afford it. Here's Martin Luther King again.
A guaranteed annual income could be done for about $20 billion a year. And I say to you today that if our nation can spend $35 billion a year to fight an unjust, evil war in Vietnam and $20 billion to put a man on the moon, it can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet right here on earth.
So the provision of a UBI is a deeply democratic question relating to equality and what we value and what we prioritise. Ben Spies-Butcher argues for a flipped way of framing social spending.
We traditionally go, well, spending on hospitals and schools is a cost in the budget. And we want to minimise costs in the budget because we don't want to pay high taxes. But increasingly, governments around the world, really led by Europe, I think, have moved to what's called a social investment approach that says, actually these things they're not costs, they're investment, but they're investment in social and human capacities rather than physical ones. So we should think of the healthcare system, we should think of the education system, of the housing system, like we think of airports and bridges, that they create the capacities for the economy to work effectively and to work at a more productive level. So we would start to go, well, how do we ensure that people are healthy in the first place? And that does lead you to policies like universal housing and universal incomes as effective ways to be able to ensure people can live healthy lives, productive lives.
In August 2023, wildfires devastated the Hawaiian island of Maui, and inspired by Dolly in Gatlinburg 7 years earlier, Oprah Winfrey took up the cause.
The greatest sense of empowerment is being able to have some control when everything seems so out of control, and we're calling it People's Fund of Maui.
Every adult resident who was displaced on Maui is eligible for $1,200 per month during the recovery.
While we don't have any examples in Australia of a universal basic income being set up by either government or celebrity after a bushfire, we do have some form with UBI. For a year during COVID, the Australian federal government provided the JobKeeper payment, a form of guaranteed income at a much higher rate than the unemployment benefits.
We certainly know from Australia that led to real improvements in health and mental health outcomes in terms of financial security, and that was explicitly a sort of disaster emergency payment.
According to Ben Spies-Butcher, if we were to contemplate a UBI for communities impacted by disasters, we'd need
payments that last for about 2 years. So that's about the amount of time that it takes to stabilise what's going on, for people to plan and think about where they're going to be and then return back to normal. There's a really important role just to create an economic floor for people who are at the front line of those disaster impacts, to make sure that people have the space just to be able to take stock of where they are, deal with their immediate needs, and then make the kinds of plans that mean they have successful futures.
And this includes the future of the community they live in, because as we know, it's the social cohesion that is key in both individual and community recovery. And a UBI gives people more capacity to participate in civil society, in community-led recovery, in democracy. Here's how Jenny and Carol from Malakuta imagine a UBI.
It is a way of empowering people. It speaks to dignity too, that you're able to hold your head up and you're able to pay your bills.
Absolutely. I can see that making a tremendous difference in a recovering community if there was that provision of income that nobody had to worry about. And I think that it's justifiable just purely in terms of how hard recovery is. For some people, it's been like this awful perfect storm, and it would be vastly different if they didn't have to worry about where their money for food was coming from.
On top of the practical and mental health benefits of a UBI post-disaster, there would be broader social benefits of enabling people to support each other and participate in community-led recovery.
We all got cheques for thousands of dollars, but those were, they were spent in next to no time because people had nothing. Instead, you could institute something like a UBI and support people to participate.
There's so many absolutely bone-weary, exhausted volunteers that are trying to get things done for their organisations, or people trying to do MADRA over and above their jobs. Now that is just too hard.
As Paula Jorgensen observed, for many, just getting to a community meeting is a challenge.
They have to travel at least 45 minutes each way to come to a meeting because their district is so vast, right? They don't get reimbursed for their travel. People are taking time off their jobs, off their farms to attend to community recovery, which you need to give people the privilege to do it. Don't just let the ones who already have the privilege do it. That's what I want to say right there. That would be the best reason to have universal basic income so that people could participate.
Participation. This is something we've heard about a lot throughout this series. And yet, when we think of democracy, most of us think in terms of representative democracy and the single act we take every few years of marking a ballot paper. That's definitely how I thought about it, if I thought about it at all as a 20-year-old, before I attended ANU and got involved in student politics. I was very shy, but I hung around and listened intently to the older activist students. One of them, Beth, explained that at ANU, the Students' Political Association was a participatory democracy. Huge blank stare from me, and so she followed up with, so instead of a bunch of student representatives acting like a mini parliament, the decisions are made by student general meetings which anyone can attend. Okay, I could grasp the idea, but I couldn't quite see what the big deal was. Beth sighed. Policy decisions have to be approved by a general meeting, which all students can attend, and any student can propose anything. It means students are more engaged with the issues because they have direct power. We have a student president, but they can only implement the decisions of the general meeting. I kind of got it, but I was more impressed because Beth was impressed, because Beth was, well, impressive. So to understand better, I went to a few general meetings, but the tedium of those meetings was anything but impressive. Then, in March of my third year, the right-wing students moved a motion to remove the elected student president, Katie Andrews, a perfectly good and hard-working student rep. So it was all hands on deck to get as many supportive people as possible to attend the general meeting. We made flyers and posters, we stood outside lectures, we accosted people in the refectory. Democracy was at stake. Our biggest fear was that with hundreds of liberal-leaning students in the fully catered on-campus colleges who only had to walk a few minutes to attend, that they'd have the numbers. On the day of the meeting, we waited nervously, and then they began to arrive in their droves, and before long the entire hall was spilling over with students. And it was only when Katie stood up and there was a deafening cheer that I knew whose side they were on. The cheers were followed by howls of condemnation when the mover of the motion stood up and said, "We withdraw the motion. It was an April Fool's joke." The date was April the 1st, but it was way after midday. In the meantime, I'd seen participatory democracy in action, and I was a convert. All these generally apathetic, passive students had been galvanised into taking political action because their presence mattered. But it turns out participatory democracy is far from a perfect form of democracy.
Of course, participatory democracy can become dominated by people highly motivated and highly active in the community. It can be dominated by gender and class and cultural dimensions, people who have time, people who have different levels of education, etc. Now, there are all ways of addressing that.
So again, the democratic devil is in the detail. It's not enough to say anyone can get involved or to blame people for not participating. We need to work hard to enable and entice people into participating. We need to actively seek out, encourage and make space for the quiet, small or missing voices. And as we explored in the last episode, we need to pay close attention to the participatory methods we use. Despite its flaws, I've clung on to the idea of participatory democracy, not only because it clearly allows for equal say, but because I truly believe that when we include all voices, we make better, more robust and more caring decisions. And in recovery from disaster, this is the balm of belonging and the grace that holds us together. In the same valley called participatory democracy is a new tree, albeit a grafted one made of hardware and software, acronyms and applications. We now have amazing technological tools for enabling participation at distance and in real time, with preferencing and consensus building for huge numbers of people. Of course, there are pros and cons and issues to be sifted and sorted, but with democratic values, good dialogue and open deliberation practices, we can learn what works and add technology to our toolkit of democratic innovation in recovery. It's one thing to have money in your pocket from a UBI and to foster participation in community recovery after disaster. But when you follow the money, the big money, the decisions are being made way up the power chain, despite the outcomes being felt way down on the ground in community. Everything from replacing destroyed public buildings to employing community recovery workers to funding community arts programs is controlled by one level of government or NGO or another.
You can look around local governments in New South Wales and Victoria, which represent about 60% of the population of Australia, and they're dominated by social workers, engineers and accountants. And essentially our local governments reproduce those three professions in positions of power. And so you get your shire engineer, you get your welfare department, and you get your budgeting. And the professionals in the bureaucracy make all the decisions about the budget. Then they take it to the council for approval, basically. And there might be a few variations on the original, but not anything transformational.
Daryl Taylor from Kinglake again takes a critical lens to our system for deciding how we spend public money.
I did a survey of 1,000 democratic innovations for local government in Victoria 20 years ago, and by far and away the most outstanding one was participatory budgeting from Brazil.
Participatory budgeting, or PB, sounds like it's just participatory democracy but around the spending of public money. And in one sense it is, but it's also a very specific modern democratic process that started in 1989 in Porto Alegre, then a Brazilian city of 1.2 million. And at its height, 80,000 people in Porto Alegre were involved in the PB process, directly deciding by resident vote how $200 million a year would be spent. To simplify it terribly, PB involves bringing people together, supporting them to brainstorm ideas for what changes and projects they'd like to see in their community. Experts then support volunteers to develop the ideas into proposals. The proposals are voted on and the ones with the most votes are implemented. And the following year, it starts again.
You're actually talking about resources that are going to be spent on a community, not on a national level, and having direct input for everybody potentially within that community to participate in the process of deciding how resources are going to be allocated.
This is Michael McGann, the political scientist from the University of Melbourne, who we heard talking about bureaucracies back in episode 2. Since its birth in 1989, participatory budgeting has not only spread geographically, it's spread in its application. It's been used in cities and towns and neighbourhoods, in schools and churches and hospitals. But as far as I've been able to discover, it hasn't been used in the wake of a disaster.
I would love to see participatory budgeting as a thing after disaster. I think it would be the thing that would break the nexus.
And of course, as we've heard often throughout this podcast, a participatory process has collateral benefits.
Part of the arguments for participatory budgeting is not only that it increases, if you like, the say of the community over how budget should be spent, but it actually also empowers them collectively and promotes their sort of collective agency.
Like all participatory processes, PB can be done well and it can be done poorly. And to do it well is not cheap or fast. But then neither are executives or accountants or consultants.
And participatory budgeting, Parton is illustrative because they went to very great efforts to ensure that Indigenous Brazilians, low-educated families were given an opportunity to actually participate in the whole budgeting process. That was kind of supported by civil society organizations that were involved in trying to include those communities in the participatory budgeting process.
So in Porto Alegre, the birthplace and poster child for participatory budgeting, they worked really hard to bring marginalised voices into the process, to create a broad base of participation. And they did that over years. So people learnt that their participation was meaningful. Word got around. The results could be seen. They were tangible. And each time more people participated as they came to trust the process. But that's not always what happens.
As participatory budgeting has kind of travelled to other jurisdictions and beyond its original starting point, it's kind of morphed into often like an illusion of participation or illusion of community inclusion. So you have to be careful here as to, is this actually just kind of carefully managed elite stakeholder engagement, or is this genuinely an empowering process? So what tends to happen is you can have a kind of self-selection model of participation where everybody's invited to come along and you don't go out actively looking for the representation and participation of the harder to reach groups. Those who don't have time on their hands, those who aren't highly educated, have information resources about the problem. So you tend to get participation skewed towards those who have the most time and resources on their hands and more highly educated people.
This is similar to the issue Iverson raised in relation to participatory democracy. And it's also one of the big challenges with all community-led recovery. And it is, of course, one of the arguments for a universal basic income. All participatory processes need
active efforts to involve those who usually don't participate.
So it's not a quick fix, but the rewards?
You've got to partly prepare people for participatory budgeting. So, having practice cycles. What they found in Porto Alegre in Brazil is over about 3 or 4 iterations, all of a sudden people get the sense, they're going to do what we suggest. We can be more ambitious. We can look more long term. It's not about problem solving in really narrow prescribed boxes. It's about socio-ecological systems and how we influence socio-ecological systems over 100 years. And so you get this very, very different approach when you deeply democratize the spending of money.
So for community-led recovery to have meaning, we must bring communities into settling for themselves how money is to be spent on them after a disaster, so that it's not the contortions of a nameless, faceless bureaucracy assessing and ribbon-cutting politicians choosing, but the community itself deciding and reaping the benefits that come with collective empowerment. Let's pivot now to look at another form of democratic structure that could be very useful in a post-disaster world, especially when multiple communities have been affected. It's called deliberative democracy. Sometime after we moved to Macedon, I'd left the law, had my 3rd child, and I started studying group facilitation. I wanted to be part of processes where consensus and collaboration were the goals, not winning and losing like our adversarial systems. And it was then that I saw this opportunity to go to Canberra as a volunteer for the first ever Citizens' Parliament. I wasn't 100% sure of what a citizens' parliament was, but I knew enough to know it was a deliberative democratic process and that I wanted to be there. So at the last minute I caught a plane to that familiar city, the nation's capital, where I'd been a student for 5 years. Unlike the people Judge Stretton talked about in the 1939 Royal Commission report, I did not go in the shadow of dread expectancy or feel the imminence of danger. But danger was imminent. The Citizens' Parliament was held at the historic and grand old Parliament House, and months before I showed up to volunteer, a team had been working long and hard to bring things together for Australia's first and so far only Citizens' Parliament. The process went something like this. 9,000 people across every electorate in Australia were randomly picked from the electoral roll and invited to participate in a 3-day deliberation in Canberra. 30% said, sure, why not? This process of selecting participants at random is also called sortition and comes from the ancient Greeks. Of those who said yes, 150 were selected so that there was one from each of the 150 federal electorates and that the 150 represented Australia's demographic makeup as far as it relates to age, gender, education and cultural background. There were a few preliminary sessions. Materials were distributed to get people to think about the key question they would be deliberating on. How can Australia's political system be strengthened to serve us better? And then they came to Canberra and they were given a seat in the imposing green-leathered House of Representatives. And I was there with the other volunteers looking on from the public gallery. On that first afternoon, the former Liberal Senate leader, Fred Chaney, explained what would happen.
A lot of the conversations will be in small groups, so that you can actually genuinely exchange views, and ultimately every person here will get a chance to prioritise and to engage in ways that means that no one will be silenced by the noisier people here, which is so often the case when you have a meeting. This is not a government event.
The event was the initiative of an organisation called the New Democracy Foundation. The next day, we were in the wood-panelled members' dining room. The citizens' parliamentarians were seated at tables in groups of 4 to 6, along with a table facilitator. Here's one of the citizens describing the setup.
We had a laptop at each table, and we had microphones at each table. We had tape recorders and things like that. But the information that was being tapped into the laptop was basically our discussion. That was linked up to a bank of computers in another room where we had New Democracy people were sitting there, analysing that data, putting that data into graphs and matriculations and all sorts of things. We were getting feedback almost live to what we were talking about.
We can get a glimpse in this description of how technology can be used to enable participation.
And had we not had that, we certainly wouldn't have been able to do what we did in the 3 days that we did here. To embrace the digital technology that was available certainly made it happen. Had it not been a digital environment, it would have been very, very slow and boring and laborious.
Instead, it was thrilling to be ringside at this event, to be a fly on the wall. I didn't have to do much, so most of the time I had the luxury of observing the process, the facilitators, the experts, and most of all, the citizens. The diversity of opinions amongst the citizens was wide, but the processes that fostered everyone's voice, listening, and the shared goal of answering the question were powerful motivators. They were forced and ended up wanting to find a way through together. Like all our democratic options, deliberative democracy has weaknesses and drawbacks. The biggest one for me, wedded as I am to participatory democracy, is that it limits participation to those who've been randomly selected. Supporters of deliberative democracy argue it shouldn't be done in isolation. Other forms of democracy and participation can run alongside and be used to inform the deliberative process. In the world at the moment, Ireland is the standout country using deliberative processes. Here's Claudia Chorwitz from the Irish organisation Democracy Next. And a heads up, a citizens' assembly is one of several terms for a randomly selected group of people brought together to deliberate.
It's been a decade that Ireland has been using citizens' assemblies on an ongoing basis at the national level. And one of the most best-known examples is the citizens' assembly that they had about changing the constitution around abortion. So this took place during a process they were doing between 2016 and 2018. There were 100 people randomly selected to be representing that diversity of Irish society. And they heard from lots of different experts on the issue, but also advocates from both sides of it. They heard from people with lived experience. They listened to one another, and they recommended that Ireland should change the constitution on abortion. But they also made more nuanced recommendations about if people were to vote for this change, how should the legislation change? So going into the more nuanced discussions about under what conditions and when, etc., this assembly did recommend there should be a referendum, which did take place, and the Irish public voted in favour of constitutional change. And it's one of 4 constitutional referendums that have taken place after citizens' assemblies have recommended them. So the other ones were on same-sex marriage, on divorce, and on blasphemy.
That is a pretty impressive list of changes that have been successfully recommended by a citizens' assembly. The Australian Citizens' Parliament I attended was not nearly so embedded in the political system. There was a representative of the Prime Minister who attended at the end to receive the final recommendations, but there was no undertaking to do anything more than receive the document. Despite this lack of political commitment, the event was a significant example of deliberative democracy, and the depth of consideration by ordinary citizens to the principles and practices of democracy was heartening. Here's 2 of the citizens chosen by their peers to speak at the final session when the recommendations were tabled.
It's been an exciting and wonderful process, and I'd like to explain what the process was. We actually listened, and we worked together, and we spoke, and we actually learnt what we call the Citizens' Parliament Cha-Cha-Cha. Was we spoke, we listened, we worked together, deliberated, and we came up with these proposals. But the proposals came through an understanding, and this deliberative process is something very special. It was about engagement. It was about empowerment, and it gave us an incredible energy.
If this is a part of a new direction for Australia, then I think we should embrace it. I met a lot of really intelligent people as well over the weekend with really good ideas. And it was really good, actually, to talk to people about their political background, about having an argument. And I never saw one. You can't sort of walk up and do this. It's pretty difficult. I'm, like all these other people here, just a citizen at the end of the day. It's been hot.
It was definitely hot, and it was fire season. On the Friday night, I'd spoken to my partner, Adrian, who said he'd sent the kids to stay with relatives in Melbourne for the weekend, which at the time I thought was a rather convenient way for him to have a weekend on his own. But he hadn't been living with me through those years of CFA work not to understand fire risk. He said the Premier had announced that Saturday would be the worst fire weather since Ash Wednesday. The date was Friday the 6th of February 2009. Late the next day, news came through. There were serious fires in Victoria and 8 people had died. I was gutted. I knew it wasn't Macedon. I'd been in touch with Adrian, and he was sitting on the porch in 40-degree heat, a mop across his lap, much like a shotgun, watching the north horizon for smoke. But I also knew fire was blazing through communities just like mine, communities I'd worked in, facilitating bushfire preparations. The next morning, more news trickled in. There were 34 dead. I could think of nothing else. I wondered how the groups I'd facilitated had fared. Had they acted on the information and advice I'd given them? Had they died because of it? Despite the fact that I could do nothing, it seemed unthinkable for me to do anything. I watched as everyone gathered on the steps of Parliament House for the big group photo, but I just couldn't join in. I was filled with heartache and dread. That night I flew home, and not far outside Melbourne, in the darkness out of the plane window, I saw a long, bright line of fire stretching across the mountain ranges, like a wide orange coastline. And a vague thought fluttered in amongst the awe and grief. Maybe there's something that is mine to do that connects democracy and disaster. In the decade and a half since the Black Saturday bushfires and the Australian Citizens' Parliament, there's been more people and places having a crack at deliberative democracy. While there are lots of different names like citizens' juries, panels, forums and assemblies, mini-publics, public deliberation, deliberative engagement, deliberative budgeting, to be in the realm of deliberative democracy, there are 5 criteria. Here's some audio from the Essential Services Commission of Victoria explaining.
The first principle is to randomly select your participants. The second principle is to make sure you allow enough time. To make thoughtful recommendations, participants need time to fully understand the issue. The third principle is that you must provide a clear, plain English question to your panel. The fourth principle is about upfront authority. The panel must be assured that the council will give careful consideration to their recommendations. The fifth principle is information. To make good recommendations, the panel needs to know what they are talking about.
In Victoria, deliberative democratic processes have been used in situations like the 100-person jury in the city of Geelong with the remit. Our council was dismissed. How do we want to be democratically represented by a future council? Yarra Valley Water commissioned 35 jurors to consider the question, we need to find a balance between price and service which is fair for everyone. How should we do this? And in 2020, a new Local Government Act mandated all Victorian local councils to include deliberative engagement practices, a rather vague and undefined term, when developing certain council plans, which has brought on a flurry of activities in the 5 years it's been in operation. In the field of disasters, there have been a few citizens' juries and assemblies relating to preparedness for disaster, particularly around climate change. And there are many examples of communities in recovery using deliberation, meaning open events where people come together for meaningful conversations about issues relating to recovery, like the ones we explored in the last episode. These are deliberative, but they're not a closed group of randomly selected participants. Instead, they're a form of participatory democracy where the whole community is invited. And at the local level, this is usually what's needed, where agency and social relationships are as valuable as any other outcome. But when whole regions are impacted, containing many communities, each unique in their needs and capacity, with an uneven distribution of well-educated and system-savvy citizens, and with variations in their dramatic imagery, noticed or ignored through the vagaries of the media, then deliberative democracy has a critical role to play in fairly supporting all communities. Whether it's images being beamed around the world of Malakuta under a blood-red sky and tourists being rescued by the Navy, or the number of professional retirees with experience in government living there, or the thousands of people who've loved Malakuta through their summer holidays, Malakuta was able to attract much more attention and therefore money than other communities. I heard anecdotal stories, not hard to believe, that other, maybe more rural, remote or lesser-known communities were crying in frustration as they watched Malakuta get
well over the $50 million mark in terms of money that's come in as a response to different grants and applications and funding requests and so on.
Instead, imagine if at the local, state and/or federal level there was a group of willing people randomly selected from the impacted areas who were kept informed about the needs and capacity in each community, the programs and money available, and outside of the pressure of politics and media, they develop an equitable and balanced distribution of the funds across all impacted areas. Then, within each community, a participatory process could decide how the money was allocated. So no pitting groups and communities against each other, no media-driven sensational knee-jerk political decisions, and way less energy wasted on onerous grant applications. From the highly organised option of deliberative democracy to the other end of the spectrum. We've already heard mention of self-organising systems in previous episodes.
And what we see emerging now is organizations of thousands of people that operate in self-organizing ways.
There's something about the decision-making process and the self-organising within communities that can really support that.
That communities who suffered in the fires were galvanised into self-organisation very quickly.
We had 16 self-organising systems that emerged in the aftermath of disaster. They meet every fundamental human, social and ecological need.
With his ever-changing parade of international visitors, Daryl Taylor in Kinglake has heard about community self-organising systems in other places in the world, in particular South America.
4 Argentinians, 2 Colombians, a Chilean and a Mexican all live here over the last 2 years. And they've been amazing. They talk about barrios. So barrios are the self-organising systems at a neighbourhood scale. This is, I think, what makes the biggest difference for recovery. If you've got a model of your community as a map that maps the neighbourhoods, like we've got natural borders, like the main street, like the creeks, we've got estates in between the creeks, we've got settlements on a ridge, and you can map it really easy. Like there's 11 or 12 neighbourhoods in this settlement here. And if there were just enough seed funding to support good hosting and good conflict resolution or conflict transformation skills, then you could support people to go from 0 to 100 in terms of being integrated at that small human scale. It's less than Dunbar's number. It's less than 150 people in each neighbourhood.
Dunbar's number comes from the evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar, who said there's a limit to the number of stable relationships people are mentally able to maintain at any one time.
So it's a really deeply knowable community. It just needs time, energy and a little bit of focus.
Not only has Daryl been thinking long and hard about these issues, he's applying them in practical ways in his community. He suggests having neighbourhood or place-based preparedness on one axis, and then from the broader community, delegates from your interest groups like sport, arts, business networks, that sort of thing on the other.
And then that then becomes your recovery leadership group. And you need some kind of governance structure. So it's a really good idea just to have a minimalist kind of structure, but something that's approved in law. So you've at least got something that's defensible. Otherwise, you just get rode roughshod over by whatever the state government decides it wants to do.
So a bit like Cabago, Daryl here is suggesting a kind of hybrid model where there's a foundation of emergent self-organising groups and activities, and somewhere in the mix there's a light governance structure that can hold its own in the world of government and corporations and law. But the point of self-organising is not to be hybrid, but to emerge, to be adaptive and dynamic. Diversity's a catchword in nature, but in the era of big bureaucracy, we often forget it's also what makes humanity resilient. And self-organising invites us to springboard off our uniqueness of people and place and time. And so we come to the end of Democracy After Disaster. If you have made it this far, you have my eternal and heartfelt gratitude. It's been a long haul. I want to finish with this quote from Duncan Iverson, building on the work of Indigenous leader Noel Pearson.
Noel Pearson has talked about the three great pillars of Australia's modern identity.
The ancient Indigenous heritage, which is Australia's foundation, the British institutions built upon it, and the adorning gift of multicultural migration.
I think there's a fourth, or at least a variation on the second, which is Australia's democratic institutions and the ability to innovate democratically, given the challenges we face.
We have a history of democratic innovation and leadership in Australia, so together let's make the threat and reality of disaster push us to create a better future for everyone. Democracy After Disaster is written, produced and hosted by me, Kate Lawrence from Storyground, on the unceded lands of the Wurrung-speaking people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to ancestors and elders. I thank them for their careful management of fire in this landscape and their inspiring sense of community. This podcast has had support directly and indirectly from many people, and I offer my heartfelt thanks. Firstly, all the people I spoke to who gave up their time, sometimes hours, and were patient with my rambling and unfocused questions, and who maybe also listened to draft episodes. Your deep commitment to your communities, to a sense of justice and fairness, and to democracy is my great hope for all of us. To Steve Pascoe, Jenny Lloyd and Paula Jorgensen for listening to draft episodes sometimes twice and being ever so kind, encouraging and insightful in response. Not only is this series so much better for their wisdom and care, their presence throughout the process felt like community. To Jane Curtis for being the best podcasting buddy I could ever hope for her astute feedback on episode 1, as well as countless pearls of wisdom dropped through our regular conversations. To my writers group and the work I've done over several years when we've been on retreat, thank you for having retreats. And I am so looking forward to working on something else at the next retreat. And lastly, to family and friends who have put up with me saying 4 years, yes, I'm still working on the Democracy After Disaster podcast. I will bore you no longer. Well, not about this topic anyway. You can find out more about this series on the Storyground website. This project is supported by a grant from the National Australia Bank. If you like the podcast, please rate and review it wherever you listen. And most importantly, tell your colleagues, friends and family. And if you have any comments, questions or feedback, please email me, kate@storyground.com.au. Thanks for listening.